Hey y'all, so we are back again with another episode of Poly Side Eye. Hey Jared, it's been a
Hello.
while.
It has, yeah. I'm teaching now, so it's consuming quite a bit of my time, but I'm glad we were able to find some time to talk about this.
Yeah, and I've seen him like what? I seen you like last week.
Yeah, we've seen each other a lot, actually. Well, during the summer, and I feel like the last month or so.
Right, you're coming this weekend.
I am. So
Right.
yeah.
Wow, you're looking really refreshed.
Yeah.
Like,
Stay youthful.
thank you. Got me looking all dusty right now. Jesus. Anyway, so this topic was Jared's idea, and this is more leaning on the entertainment side. We were talking about the political economy of Hollywood and why is streaming going up? I mean, we are going through a writer's strike, actor's strike. There's a lot of strikes going on. I think this is just a different time because I feel like a lot of people are just fed up.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to talk about this because I have been seeing a lot of people, especially on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, have been complaining that the price that they're paying for their subscriptions, especially like if you do like Hulu or like YouTube TV and those things are going up. And so people are like, well, aren't these studios, are these streaming companies, aren't they saying like, oh, they don't have any money to like pay anybody, but y'all can raise the prices? Like, what's going on here? And so I feel like the discussions about the whole, both the writer's strike and what's going on with streaming, to me, are missing some really fundamental points, especially about the economy and like how the entertainment industry sits within the broader US economy that I feel like we could clarify here.
Right, because I was going to ask you, for you to explain to people, like, what's the correlation, since we are called poli sci like, what's the correlation between what's going on in Hollywood to politics?
Right. So let's take a very brief history lesson. So people don't tend to think of like television and that form of media as being like specific to a certain period in US history. But there's a reason that TV was kind of emerged or exploded when it did. Part of the reason TV became a thing is honestly to just sell, to advertise. Like, so after World War II, the US economy pretty much stagnated. So we remember the war and like there's all this spending, especially on military weapons and so on, that pretty much propped up the US's economy. And so after the war ended, a lot of political elites were like, well, we're scared that the US might fall into a recession or maybe even back into a depression because spending is going to taper off after we saw this explosion of like economic activity in the 30s and 40s. And so one way that elites decided to address this fear that they had about falling into depression was through consumer culture, mass consumption, essentially. So how do you know what you want to buy? When you buy things, aside from like things you need, like food and stuff, like if you want to buy things, like how do you learn about the things that you want to buy?
Commercials,
Right.
billboards, ads.
Exactly. Exactly. So advertising is a huge, huge, huge industry. It arose really in the 30s as really as a means of propaganda, a means to make people want things they didn't need. Like that's the only way you can have a consumer society is if you make people want things they don't need. So TV became a perfect vessel to do that because people were like, oh shit, like we can just show these really cool commercials. It'll make kids want these toys they don't need. It'll make women want these dresses they don't need. It'll make men want these tools they don't need. All this stuff they don't need. But we're gonna turn it into this like billion-dollar industry. We're gonna use television as a means to like drive this industry essentially. In the late 90s, really into the 2000s, I would say, like you start to see television ratings start to stagnate. And so advertisers are like, well, like we're not really quite getting the same return on our investment because people aren't watching TV as much as they used to. And then with the advent of streaming, which I'm going to get to this in a second because I think this is really important. But streaming completely upends the way that advertisers think about this medium or think about like television or shows as a way to advance products. So when you watch your favorite show on Netflix or HBO, whatever, like unless you have one of those versions where you have to pay for the ads, like typically you don't see any advertisements. And so this might sound great in theory because you're like, oh, great, I can watch this hour-long show and not be interrupted 4 or 5 times. But you're losing out on a significant amount of, well, companies are losing out on a significant amount of advertising dollars that really was the engine behind the television or the industry for so long. And so now why does this matter for what we're seeing right now? Well, because streaming, again, doesn't depend as much on advertising as like traditional forms of TV did, now you're really in a situation where you have a lot of hands in the pot, but the amount of revenue that's coming into the industry is really having to be split among a few more hands, essentially, without actually growing the pie. And so what's happening now is that, the streaming companies are like, look, we're not generating the type of revenue that we used to. So yes, in the old days, we could give you all of these residuals and all of these other contracts, give you a bigger piece of the pie, but that pie is stagnant now. So like, and we still have investors who expect a growing piece of that pie, otherwise they wouldn't be investing in these companies. And so now what you're seeing is like irreconcilable difference among, let's say, writers or actors or people who are like, hey, why am I not getting what I used to get, kind of in the golden age, so to speak. And these companies that are like, look, the golden age is over. Like, we don't like the pie is either stagnant or shrinking. And so you have to take what you can get. And so the reason I've been saying I don't see how you can square that circle is because unless you fundamentally change the way that the whole industry is organized, like, I don't really know how you could get out of that.
Yeah, but I'd be thinking, okay, there's these executives, like just me looking from the outside in, that are making quadruple, like millions of dollars off the backs of, actors, writers. So why can't they just dip into what they're being paid? Because according to a video I saw of Kendrick Sampson on the picket lines, like he said, all they're asking is for, I believe, 0.2%. So it just doesn't seem like they would even notice that.
Well, 0.2% per person or like in total? Like what's the...
Yeah, now see, he didn't say all that. He just said we're just asking like 2%, 0.2% of the share, like more.
Because this is how it works. Well, we could change that, but not under this current form of capitalism we have. Where does Netflix get its money from?
I
How do
was
you
about to ask you that. I was wondering, like, I remember Netflix be having just these big ass budgets. I'm just like, where is the money coming from?
So here's the thing. Back in 2000, you remember the crash in 2008, 2009.
Yeah, it's when I graduated.
Right, exactly. So back in 2008, 2009, the US economy was, it was really in free fall. And so how did we get out of that? Like, part of the way that, well, we really didn't get out of it, but how did we band-aid that issue? So what the Federal Reserve and the Treasury ended up doing is saying, okay, like, we realize all these bankers pretty much bankrupted the country and they probably should be in jail, but we can't do that. So like, what we're going to do is rather just print all of this money, give it to them pretty much interest free. So free money for the most part. And y'all can do whatever y'all want to do with it. And they told the public that they were doing it, bailing them out because these companies were too big to fail. And like, ultimately it was going to hurt regular people if they went under, which is not true. But anyway, that was what they were told. And so the Federal Reserve and the government, after all of these big banks came close to bankrupting the whole country, essentially, just printed all this money, gave it to them interest free, and told them like, oh, well, take this money and like go do something productive with it, which you're not, if you're a banker, like your primary task is not to do anything productive with it, is to make money for yourself. So what did they do with it? They went and it pretty much threw all of this money at some of these emerging companies like Netflix that at the time, like, pretty much had no value. Netflix, I think, only turned a profit maybe like a couple years ago, if that. So Netflix existed almost for 20 years before it even turned a profit. But during this period, they're producing all of this great content. How are they doing it though? They're doing it based on all this free money that the government gave them. Well, that money actually wasn't free. And what ends up happening is, we've talked about this on this show before, about a year and some change ago, the Federal Reserve was like, okay, we can't really do this free money thing anymore. So like, we're going to start charging you more interest for this money. And so you have all these people who are like, oh shit, like now we have to pay interest on like all of these bonds and things that we had back in the day. So now we have to pay that to investors, because investors who've invested in Netflix expect a return. And so now Netflix is caught between a rock and a hard place. Not just Netflix, but all these streaming companies, Disney even too, are caught between a rock and a hard place, because on one side of the equation, you have all these rich investors who are like, look, we invested our money. Again, it's not really their money because the government printed it and they got access to it. But we want our money with the return. We don't give a fuck about the actors or the actresses. We want our money, or because that's how you exist. You exist because we invest in your company. Netflix and all these companies have a fiduciary responsibility. All that means is that they have like legal requirements to like actually make sure that shareholders are, that they're doing it what they can to maximize their profits, essentially. So their investors are like, look, that's cute for them. Yes, we want them to have a livable wage, but I invested my money. I want my money. And so it's not just, I think though sometimes the way that people talk about these companies, they'll just be like, oh, Netflix, oh, Disney, like it's just a handful of people. But it's really a big group of investors, all of whom you wouldn't invest if you didn't expect to get a return. Like I always use the example, like would you buy a house? If somebody told you that you bought your house and there was a coin flip chance that you might lose all of the money you invested in this house, or would you do it? Most people wouldn't. People only invest if they expect that investment to grow. Now we're told all this capitalist mythology that, oh, like you have to take risks to win big, but nobody actually wants to take risks. And most of the times they don't take risks. And when risks are taken and they fail, the government steps in and bails them out. So to answer Kendrick Sampson's point about, oh, well, this is all we want, yes, you could get that, but not under this current configuration of capitalism, because as I say in my Twitter account, capitalism is a system that is designed not to work for people who have to work for a living. That's not who it's for. It's for people who want to have passive income and get that passive income through their investments. It's not for people who have to labor. It's not, that's not what the system is for. So if you want to have a more equitable system, you have to have one in which people who invest their money, and I put their money in air quotes because they didn't do anything to get that, it's all just like speculation. People who invest their money, you have to move away from that system. You have to move towards a system that gives workers more power. And we're getting there to some degree, but that's going to take time because we've had this system for centuries now. And so like, it's going to take time to like undo that.
So I have a friend that works on the studio side, and I would have loved his input. You know, if he's watching, like we could have put him in a dark room and configured his voice. Or
like in 2020, and you'd be like, it's like you couldn't hear anything you were saying. It was just like closed captions.
right. So I asked him for some pointers before we filmed this, and he did mention something that I heard you say when we were talking about this topic. He said that streaming changed the entire business model. So I was just wondering, could you just talk about that for a second?
So kind of what I was saying earlier, how did most of these networks make their money before? Is largely through advertising. And so the way that streaming changes that is, so it changed things in a few ways. One, because why did shows used to start in September and end in May or April? It's because in September, that's like back to school. It's like, okay, now we can like actually advertise. And like, again, think about television's main function as being about advertising.
And that's not entertainment. That's,
I mean, that's kind of secondary. Again, capitalism is a system that is about the generation of profits forever until the end of time. Like that's the main, anything else is kind of ancillary to that. That is the base foundation. And I hate to turn everything into like follow the money, but really that gets you like 95% of the way there. So the reason these shows started then and ended and when they did is because advertisers understood that the way that the society was structured, there are certain periods where advertising was going to be more profitable versus not. And so, but once streaming entered the fray, you didn't have the situation where shows were starting in September and ending in May and had like 20 or 25 episode seasons. It truncated everything down to about 8 to 10 episodes that kind of happened at random. So in the past, if you were a show writer or somebody affiliated with a show, let's say that went into syndication, you would get a check every time, or some type of residual every time this show was aired or whatever. And kind of, even if you weren't working, like you could, have something to kind of hold you over until you started your next show, got your next gig or whatever. But with the streaming economy, you have a situation where it's truncated from a 25 episode season down to like 8 or 10 that happens kind of at random. Like, it's not like these shows are coming on at the same time. It's just kind of happening whenever. So you get fewer episodes that you are obviously getting paid for, but not only that, but the whole concept of residuals is completely upended, because before you used to get a cut of the number of times that the show aired, irrespective of like where it was airing. But now the way that it works is Netflix and Hulu and Disney and all of them, they just buy the rights to the show. And when the rights to that show is bought, then they give you a cut at the point of purchase. But that's just a one-time thing, and you're still having to divvy that up across everybody affiliated with that show. So whereas before you're getting cut every time it's coming on TV, now you're getting it one time and that's it. And that's assuming that the networks even buy some of these shows. So what happens if you were working with a show that nobody really wants to buy the rights to, and then you're just kind of SOL. And so because streaming doesn't rely as heavily on advertising numbers, you're losing advertising dollars, you're losing a huge source of revenue there. And so now you can't even really engage in much revenue sharing because we don't have the same degree of advertising. I mean, part of it too is like, most people don't want to see ads, which I understand. Like, I don't want to see ads. I hate ads. But when you watched NBC in 1995, you didn't have a choice. Now you can opt out of it, which it might be good for the consumer experience, but in the totality or in the aggregate, it's actually not good for writers or the company, because you're losing out on all these advertising dollars. And so again, you're really contending with a situation of, you have a pie that is, if not shrinking, stagnant. And people will say, oh, they generated all these profits. Don't just look at the total profit. You got to look at the balance sheet. You got to look at the total amount that's being generated and who owes who. So like, this is like basic accounting. You might have revenues, but then you still have all of these like debts that you have to pay, or you have all these costs that you have. So if you have, let's say Netflix generates, I don't know, $50 billion in profit for the quarter. It won't be that much. It'll probably be way less than that. But for the point of example, let's say they generate $50 billion of profits. I'll see people on Twitter will be like, they made all those profits. So like, this is evidence like they can pay people more, which yes, they could, but not under capitalism, because capitalism is not designed to be equitable. It's designed so that a handful of investors can make a passive income. So if you want it to be distributed in an even way, you have to be anti-capitalist and socialist, because the whole point of socialism is saying that, oh, well, now that we have this profit, everybody who contributed should have a say in how that's divvied, not just a handful of people who invested their money in it. And so I think people get tripped up over the term socialism. Like, there has to be some huge, like, I don't know, transformation in the way that we just wake up and the whole world would look differently. But all socialism is how are you going to generate, how are you going to distribute the profit? That's really all it is fundamentally.
Earlier, you reminded me of an article, like, speaking of Netflix and buying the rights, like, Squid Games, that was big as shit. And I think everyone was like shocked that the creator came out and said he's not rich from that. He said that Netflix didn't even give him a bonus.
Yeah, I mean, because again, he's not an investor. So Netflix is probably, and again, I don't even like to just say Netflix because it makes it sound like it's a unitary thing, or it's like a singular entity. Right. Again, the board of directors and you can go look at all of this yourself. Like, I'm not, like, none of this is a secret. Like, if you just go to Netflix's website, there's like a whole investor page. So it tells you who the primary stakeholders are. It tells you like who the board, they'll call them different things. So sometimes it'll be the board of trustees, sometimes it'll be the board of supervisors, sometimes it'll be whatever. Like, it'll tell you who those people are. They are responding to their biggest investors down the chain. If you're not one of them investors, your concerns, they don't give a fuck about your concerns. So again, the way you change that is not by like turning this into a moral issue, which yes, it is immoral. But that's, to me, not a winning argument. The argument is understanding the configuration of the system. Who are the stakeholders? What are the incentives? What are their legal obligations? And trying to change that. Like, that's what you have to change. You can't shame people into paying you more. You have to argue them on their terms. Like, that's just kind of the way it works. And so I just felt very dissatisfied with a lot of the analysis, which I don't really even want to call it analysis because I don't think it was very analytical. But I found a lot of the takes to be really lacking in an understanding of like how business operates. Businesses or corporations don't have any moral responsibilities. Like, their responsibilities is to make money for their investors until the end of time. And every quarter, you're expected to make more money for your investors. And if the investors see that they're not making more money than they were making the quarter before, what are they going to do? They're going to go and invest in another company. So if you don't want that to be the case, you have to upend that entire configuration of the way that these corporations are structured. And that can be done. It just has to be done through an understanding of how the actual economy of these corporations works.
It just seemed like it's going to be very hard for that to happen, or it's going to take a long, long time. Like, I feel like Congress would have to get involved and change that entire system. And then I feel like the people that are funding Congress, I'm sure, like millionaires and billionaires, they're going to keep that from happening, I feel like.
Yeah, but that's why it's called a class struggle. Like, you have to struggle against it. There's nothing that working people have gotten has come by like moralizing people or like trying to make people feel bad. It's come from bloodshed. It's come from people willing to like fight until the last whatever. Like, it's never been easy. Like, even getting the 5-day work week, that took lots of people dying and lots of people having to push back against employers who essentially wanted to extract every single ounce of energy from their workers, until people being like, no, like, fuck this. Like, we're not going to work every day for like 14 hours just so you can go get fat off of our labor. But again, that is the basic idea of capitalism, as I've said it repeatedly and over and over and over. The point of capitalism is so a handful of people do not have to labor. The whole point is that they can live off of the labor of other people through so-called passive income and live great lives and take lavish vacations and buy big houses and like pretty much pass on that money to their children, while the rest of us toil and are stressed out and like living paycheck to paycheck. That is the edifice of capitalism. Period. Like, there's no way around that. So if you don't want that to be the case, you have to fight against it. You have to organize, and people are doing that. But I think there is still a fundamental misunderstanding of, you can't reform that. Like, you have to take it by the horns and say, look, we can't organize our society in this way. It can't just be organized around the endless accumulation of profit. Like, it has to be about, what can we do to create things that everybody can share in, so that some of us aren't living on the streets and some of us are living in huge mansions? That's not a technocratic question. It's not a policy question. It's a political question. And the only way you can answer that is by like fighting against the people who currently are writing the laws and the regulations and so on and so forth. Like, none of this is rooted in nature. Like, the reason that Netflix responds to their investors first is because, again, like, based on some of the legal jargon, like, it's structured in that way, like that they have to have a commitment to making more profits and giving it to them and not sharing it with their workers. But that's why we've had unionization in the past. That's why there's been all kind of labor struggle. Like, that is American politics. So I don't really know how you get around that.
Yeah, you're going to beat it into our audience about
If you don't learn anything else from this show, I want you to remember that one line. The point of capitalism is so a handful of people do not have to labor, so they can live off the labor of everybody else and live in big houses and eat well while the rest of us toil. Like, that's the point.
We're going to put that on a poli-sci-eye t-shirt. It's going to be poli-sci-eye on the front and the definition of what capitalism really is on the back.
Because that's the gag. That's the gag of it all. That's why I'm just like, because everything that we're taught and socialized to believe is that capitalism is about hard work and effort and all. It's like, no, it's not about those things. It is about what I just said. And so like you can't fall for the okie doke. Like, because if you fall for the okie doke, then you just believe that, oh, if I just work as hard as them, I can have some of what they have. But they don't want you to
You
have the
just took the words out of my mouth. I was about to say, well, if we just work as hard as Beyonce, we can get there.
if for every Beyonce, there's another 100 million people who are like living paycheck to paycheck. So like, are you going to look at the one case or the hundreds of millions of cases? Like, you don't look at the exception and be like, oh, if that's the exception, let's follow that route. No, you look at the other one and say, oh, these are all these people who are working hard and nevertheless are still living paycheck to paycheck.
So there was one more point that I wanted to expand upon, talking to my friend, and I was talking about like, why are streaming services going up for the consumer? He was telling me that it was because of the merging libraries, like how recently I think Discovery and Warner got together, or like with the whole Max thing, or with how Hulu, Disney, ESPN merged, or like with Peacock having Universal Studios' whole entire library. Do you see this pattern of like merging so they can get more profits out of the consumer?
Yeah, well, that's kind of the point of monopolization. So, like, the reason that monopolies are bad is because when you monopolize, you ultimately concentrate power in more and more hands, or fewer and fewer hands. And so now you have people who have a say in like what's going to be happening. And so now you have this concentration of this monopolization, and they're going to say like, well, if you want to watch this show, like either you pay up or you're just not going to see it anymore, which is also another reason that there's been this push to like digitize everything or pull everything onto streaming. So if you want to watch, I don't know, some old show from like the 70s or 80s, in the old days, you could just be like, cool, I'm going to like go to Walmart and like buy it and like watch it. Now a lot of these things are like obsolete. Like you can't buy a lot of the physical copies. And this isn't just television. It's also like movies, music, and so on and so forth. So now your only choice is, well, if you want to listen to that album or you want to watch that show, you better don't pay this streaming cost. So they're essentially charging you a rent to access something that you once enjoyed. Like, but when you're a monopoly, you can do that because you have the power to do it because you don't have another choice. Either you want to watch it or you don't. And so as long as the power is concentrated in their hands like that, they'll have the power to be able to will control over what we can and can't consume, them being the corporations and so forth. Now, that's one element of it. The other element is once you get more concentration, capitalism is a case of where you rob Peter to pay Paul. And all I mean to say that is that you just shift problems around. Like you never fix them, you just shift them around. So even in the case of monopolization, you might say that, oh, well, now I have all my favorite shows like on this one app. Like I can just like download Paramount Plus because they have all the shows I want to watch. Oh, but then they like raise the fee to like watch it. Why? Because they know that you can only come here to watch it. And when you monopolize, you have further concentration, which means you require more and more resources to keep the thing going, which means, and by resources, again, I already said, where do companies get their money from? Investors. And so as you get more investors to invest in a company, these same investors are going to want more and more of the pie. And so again, like there's really no way out of that unless you change the whole organization of like these capitalist corporations, because we're trying to get it to do something that it's not configured to do, which is to be equitable. Like it's not created to be equitable. It is necessarily designed to concentrate power and resources in fewer and fewer hands at everybody else's expense. So if you don't want that to be the case, you got to struggle against it, which again, I think people are doing that. I just think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of like that critical point.
So, we can talk about this all day, really. But in conclusion, what do you see happening in the future? What's your prediction? Do you see this strike not ending anytime soon? Also, do you see more sectors going on strike? And what I mean by that, like, other industries like going on strike.
Yeah, I totally, because again, I don't think what's happening in Hollywood is exceptional. Like to me, it is like a microcosm of the rest of capitalism. So even where I work in academia, like you see a lot of people, graduate students, and even faculty members striking for the same reason, is that when you have a system that is designed to concentrate power and resources in fewer and fewer hands, that means those resources that were otherwise distributed to other people are going to no longer be there for them. But meanwhile, the cost of everything is going up. Like your rent is going up, food prices are going up, gas is going up, you name it is going up. But your wages, everything but your wages are going up. So yes, I expect to see the same thing happen, because what we're seeing is that 95% of people are like, wait a minute, why am I not getting a bigger slice of the pie? And the answer to that is because we don't produce anything anymore in the US. So the pie is not growing. And so now we're at a point where everybody is fighting for their quote unquote fair share of that pie. But I mean, the investors and the rich capitalists they're not gonna go down without a fight. What Miley Cyrus said, I'm not going down without a motherfucking fight. That's really what it's gonna be, because like, if you only have a certain number of slices, you can either divide these slices even smaller, which the investors would never commit to, or you have to figure out a way to like grow the pie bigger. That's pretty much your only choices. You either can fight against the capitalists to get a bigger slice of a pie that they're unwilling to give, or you can try to like upend this entire configuration altogether away from one that does what I just said, which is concentrates power, resources in fewer hands, towards one that can actually produce and distribute and share that more equally. And that's, again, nothing about that is rooted in nature. It's not preordained. It's all about politics and like how much people are willing to fight for what they actually, for the work that they contributed and what they produce.
I learned so much from doing this show. I really do. Is there anything else you want to say on the topic before we log out?
I'll just in the misnote, like, because you were asking me, I don't like making predictions, but what I think is going to happen. So I think there'll be a resolution, some kind of resolution. I don't think many of the writers and actors will find it sufficient. What I think is probably going to end up happening is that you're just going to see a lot of people just throw up their hands and just leave the industry altogether. And because you have so many exits, you'll have executives and big corporations that are willing to make a few more concessions because there's fewer people to like make concessions to. But I think that unless we actually reckon with what is behind this being the strike and what's going on in Hollywood, but not just Hollywood, but within the broader economy, unless we understand that this is at root about capitalist organization, I think that of the economy, then I think we're going to be kind of moving with our hands tied. So hopefully this episode can help people have a more grounded understanding of exactly how capitalism works and why you need to understand the nuances of it in order to actually fight back against it.
Absolutely. I think you definitely made your point a lot throughout this video. So with that said, y'all know what time it is. What is the book recommendation for today?
Yes. So the name of this book is Socialism or Extinction. So that sounds intense, but pretty much what the author, it's by Ted Reese, one of my really cool comrades, and he actually lives in the UK, but he makes a really compelling argument about why socialism isn't just like a pipe dream or just like an ideological thing, but actually is necessary if we're going to survive as a species, not just for our lifetimes, but just going forward. And again, I think people get so tripped up on the term socialism, but all socialism really is at its foundation is how are we going to determine what's being produced so that we can produce things that meet everyone's needs. And second, like when we produce things and there's a surplus, which is all profit is, it's just an excess above what's being produced. Like, how do we determine how we want to distribute that? Is it going to be distributed in a fair and just way? Or is it going to be distributed in a way that a handful of people get it and so the rest of us can toil for the end of time? Like, and so I think the book lays out a really strong case for why people need to not get tripped up on the terminology and actually understand the economy of capitalism so that they can see why they should be anti-capitalist, and not only anti-capitalist, but socialist, because you could be anti-capitalist and fascist, I guess, in some ways, but anti-capitalist and so, well, actually, I don't know if you could be anti-capitalist and socialist, maybe, but anyway, anti-capitalist and socialist.
Gotcha. So the book recommendation, as always, will be down in the descriptions below. Thank you, Jared, for joining me for this very interesting conversation. I had fun doing this, as always.
A pleasure, per usual.
Yeah, let them know where they can follow you.
JAYC Tiger Fan on X or whatever it's called now, and also on Instagram, although I'm on there less frequently.
Right. I mean, you're becoming a celebrity on Twitter/X.
I don't know about that, but
So also I need to, if y'all want to rewatch this video, please take a shot every time Jared gives the true definition of capitalism.
I'm gonna start doing that literally every episode because I need that needs to be beaten into people's heads.
Right. But yeah, y'all, I would love to hear y'all thoughts on the topic at hand. And please, ask Jared any question you like. I learn something every time I do Poli Side-Eye. So yeah, make sure y'all like, comment, and subscribe and share. And we will see y'all for the next episode. Bye.